Good afternoon and welcome back to another ironic introduction to another video. Today I have kind of a bit of a rant, so bear with me. If you're not into that thing, you're probably just going to want to click off because this is a full-on rant here coming up. And that rant is the difference between a utility meta, which I really fully encourage and want to see Kabam push because that forces diversity in roster and rank ups and selectivity, and that's really, really cool. And roster meta, like full on, it's just about having a really huge roster available to you, and it's more than just having like a select amount of champions to access a broad ability usage, and straight up just like you need this champion specifically. Out of all the 120 or 130 champions, you have to have this one. And that's a huge difference from utility and roster, right? And what I'm talking about that is you've got some like really cool and frustrating, super awesome and difficult and challenging content that's absolutely frustrating, but is still utility centric. And one of those examples is selective time stream. Now, if you've done variant 3 and you do that Kang fight at the very end, that fight can be brutal and absolutely heartbreaking if you don't manage. But selective time stream is every 20 seconds the defender full heals. This cannot be prevented with any debuff like heal block, except for like Warlock's infection and Mysterio's passive heal block, because those aren't considered active debuffs, and so they're not removed from selective time stream. And additionally, this cannot be prevented with ability accuracy reduction, and the only thing that prevents this full heal from triggering is an incinerate or a shock debuff applied to champion. That's really cool. This is an amazing utility, and what makes this an amazing utility is the access we have to shock and incinerate damage champions in the game. Like, there's a good amount, you've got Human Torch and Sunspot, you've got Sentinel, Hyperion, we've Nebula to an extent. You've got some like really solid options who can meet this. I think Iron Man Infinity War, and that's really, really cool. There's a nice solid pool of champions who can incinerate and shock and can take this path down, and as long as they're maintaining those shocks and incinerates, these fights are not the absolute worst. They're not the easiest by any means, but they're also not the absolute worst. And then you have some other things here that make it both beneficial to the attacker and negative to the attacker in both regards. So it's a really, really cool interaction, and that's utility, because it's utility because you have so many options to do. There's no like, oh, you have to have this one champion. Like, you don't have to have Domino with the Red Hulk synergy. You can use one of the 10 to 20 champions who can meet this node. And yes, that's selective, and you're forced to take on that utility and that rank up in order to do this path, but it's not one champion. And that's the difference between a utility node and a roster-based node. And so you might be wondering, well, what am I talking about, roster-based nodes? And when I talk about roster-based nodes, I'm strictly talking about things like that's gonna sting. Now, that's gonna sting. This is like, in my opinion, one of the worst nodes Kabam introduced in Act 6.4. To me, it's absolute BS. I recently pulled Mr. Fantastic, so I have the answer, the select champion answer to this node, and that was the only reason I was excited for Mr. Fantastic. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of reasons to be excited over Mr. Fantastic. He's got a lot of really cool usages, some solid synergies, as you'll see here in a moment, that are really, really awesome for the game. But before this node, I had no use for Mr. Fantastic and wasn't like particularly interested in getting him. They put this node out, and then I was suddenly like, damn, I really need a Mr. Fantastic. And the reason for that is that's going to sting, is the defender takes 90% reduced damage from all sources unless suffering from a power sting effect. Additionally, the attacker's rating is increased by 40% while the opponent is suffering a power sting, and the potency of their power sting effects are increased by 300%. So yeah, so if you don't go in with the power sting, you're dealing 10% damage. That's brutal. Like, these champions already are souped up hero rating champions. This is a 55,000 Venom. You're gonna have to deal with a 56,000 or 55,000 Archangel, a almost 56,000 Warlock. Like, these are gonna be rough fights that you have to deal with. And if we don't talk about the synergy, you do have the option of Emma Frost, right? You have the option of Yellow Jacket, and you have the option of Human Torch. If there's more than those three, feel free to let me know, but those are the only three I could think of, slash when I like really looked for, those are the only three I could find Just the champion can apply Power Sting. And, you might say, okay, well, it depends on who they put on the defense. Maybe those 3 champions, it's big enough. Like, Emma Frost is a solid rank up. I know a lot of people who rank her up. I don't see a whole lot of people rushing out there to rank up a Yellow Jacket, but Human Torch is also another solid champion. So, like, yeah, Emma Frost and Human Torch, it's not the greatest utility box, but, it really depends on the path. But then you look at this path, and it's like Warlock, Omega Red, Killmonger, Man-Thing, like, this path is going to be rough if you're just trying to use Emma Frost and Human Torch. Like, you're going to get rocked, dude. So that brings me full circle to Mr. Fantastic. He is the answer. And this is why this node is a roster-specific node. Because Mr. Fantastic has the synergy called Shared Knowledge Robotics. If you bring Mr. Fantastic and Sentry, She-Hulk, Vulture, or Doc Ock, and honestly, if you have Mr. Fantastic, odds are you probably have one of these 4 champions because he's the newest of them all. There will be a point in time where people will have Mr. Fantastic but won't have one of these 4. But, statistically speaking, it's easier to pull one of these 4 than it is to pull Mr. Fantastic at the moment. But if you bring tech or science champions, debuffs also apply an indefinite Power Sting. So there's your answer around this node. Essentially, Mr. Fantastic plus synergy. And that's just not the greatest answer, right? Like that's not a great way to design a node where it's essentially like you need Mr. Fantastic synergy to take this path. And then if you have that, the path, it's a joke from there. You can bring whoever you want as long as they're within tech and science and just absolutely push your way through, no problem. But it just draws the question of like, why? And Kabam can push the argument of like, well, remember that it's static content and new champions come out and new synergies come out. And as those come out, specific paths will be easier to handle and you'll have the utility and the roster you need in order to push through. My response is that's total BS. This is one of the most frustrating things for me to see in the game because I think there's so many things they do amazing and incredibly well-designed nodes and interactions. And this is just one of those things that it's unnecessary. And it wouldn't have been hard to make it unnecessary. You can make it more painful. You don't need to make it, feasibly like completely not worth. I'm trying to find like a proper word to describe it because it's not impossible, but it is just so much more difficult that you really do. You just wait because like there's nothing in this node that is directly killing you. You are right about that in that regard. But the thing is that like these are healthy AF opponents and 90% damage reduction. You might as well not be hitting them. But, you could chip your way through, get in here and do like 900 hits or something, 1,000 hits or something. But, what would make that's going to sting like a reasonable interaction? Just make it like a 50% damage cut, 40% damage cut. Bring it to a point where it's like, hey, you really, really want Mr. Fantastic, but if you want to force your way through, it's only one path. Pop an attack boost, bring some heavy hitters, and push your way through with the reduced damage. The same way we saw 5.3, where 5.3 felt like this huge, brutal slog because you wanted to meet the classes unless you wanted to take like the reduced damage effect. But honestly, you could just pop an attack boost, bring heavy hitting champions, and push your way through with extra hits. This one, it just doesn't feel feasible because of the 90% damage reduction, and that makes it incredibly roster intensive. And I want to like really, really discourage seeing this in the game, specifically in Act 6 or Act 7, like in this quote-unquote static content that people want to push, the story mode. Because I'll talk about it in a bit, because there's a place for a node like that. And there are reasonable situations in the game where it's totally understandable to say, hey, you need this one champion. And we'll talk about that in a moment. It's just that Act 6 is 5 stars and 6 stars only. So I want to talk on like a second point, because there's multiple instances in Act 6 where this happens, but I want to talk on a second point that I think most people will recognize and are fully aware of where this happens, and is like a brutal wall that people run into that has gotten better over time, and it meets Kabam's like expectations, and it's this Act 6.2.2 Mr. Sinister boss. Mr. Sinister is already a rough fight. Every time you crit him, he heals up. So like generally speaking, you want to bring some form of heal block or something, some way to deal with him in that regard. But then he has EMP modification. So, pretty much when he throws his specials, you're just dying to passive shock. Yeah, nothing you can really do about that. You're just going to die to it, unfortunately. And then, like, if that wasn't enough, right? Like, it's already a Mr. Sinister, so he's tankier than he appears. He's a boss fight, so he's got huge hero rating. And EMP modifications, so you're just passively dying every time he throws a special. On top of that, he has Caustic Temper. And this is the part that just makes it go from like, okay, it's a frustrating fight, you need heal block, you need to push your way through, to full on, this fight is a roster wall. You have to have specific champions or specific synergies in order to push through. And for a long time, Mr. Sinister, people just said, if you don't have Heimdall Angela or you don't have Heimdall Hela, you just wait. You just don't do 6.2.2. And that is bogus. You can't push through a chapter because of that. Because let me tell you, it's doable. You can kind of sort of do it with Ghost. You can push your way through with like a Hyperion or maybe a Kamala Khan, because they can kind of deal with the Caustic Temper node. But inevitably, the EMP modification will kill you, and you're just forced to revive your way through if you don't have the Heimdall Angela, Heimdall Hela synergy. And even if you have Heimdall Hela, Heimdall Angela synergy, this fight is brutal. Like, it's just, there's just not a lot of good options even with that synergy, and that's what makes it like absolutely unreasonable. Yeah, that's what it is. So this is a roster node too, and this is a cool fight. This fight in general, like when you have the answers for it, is really satisfying. It's a really neat and clever node interactions. Like if we're talking about scaled difficulty, this fight has that in spades. It's super cool. I really, really think it's interesting and interactive. I just don't think it belongs in Act 6, right? Because it's so roster restrictive and it's so much of a roster gate that so many people are going to come here and they just have to wait. And there's nothing they can do about it. So yeah, I don't approve. So why do I like hype these nodes as really interactive and neat and awesome and challenging if I don't want to see them in Act 6? Well, the major reason I complain about these nodes is because it's Act 6. In Act 6, you can only bring 5 and 6-star champions. So if you specifically need Mr. Fantastic or you specifically need Heimdall Angela synergy, Act 6, so many players can get to Act 6 without having those available to them. And as so long as this is a 5 and 6-star chapter, it shouldn't have that hard of a restriction. Push the utility. Push bleed immune, poison immune, incinerate immune. Push, you need to have a champion in armor breaks. You need to have a champion who is armor break resistant, or you need to have a champion that nullifies or power control. All of that are super fine. There's a large pool of champions in each of those categories that can respond to those needs. But in Act 6, when you say you put a node into place and it's pretty much you need to have this champion or you need to have this synergy, that's when it becomes not okay with me. Because there is a place in the game where those nodes and those boss fights and those interactions already are perfectly reasonable. And like Kabam has access to give us that incredibly challenging and frustrating fight without completely isolating the community between the high-end players and the mid-tier players. And that's variants. Variants are accessible. You can bring a 2-star into these, except for variant 4, which it's star based, but that's fine, that's its own thing. But like variants 1 through 3, you can bring 4 stars in, you can bring 3 stars in, and so having that like necessary synergy becomes way more reasonable here. If you want to put a synergy like the Power Sting node in a variant, super reasonable, because someone can just slot in a 3-star Mr. Fantastic. And you can make the argument, hey, it's going to take them a long time to get a 3-star Mr. Fantastic. But I can tell you, you're going to get a 3-star Mr. Fantastic a lot faster than you're going to get a 5 or 6-star one. You know, especially if you're fishing for him as like a free-to-play player or something. And it becomes more reasonable and understandable to say, hey, you can't do this path in variant until you get that champion. It's still frustrating and still an aggravation, but you don't feel like you're gated. It's a specific variant that you're just waiting and holding onto those rewards until you get the proper champion, and then you can unit your way through if you're impatient, and it's reasonable. But in the story, to get to Act 6.2.2 and then say, I can't progress because I don't have Heimdall, it just feels bad, man, and it's just poor design. Like, even to an extent, I was okay with the champion boss fight. I thought the champion boss fight, while aggravating, while incredibly annoying, there's still, like, a reasonably, like, semi-reasonable amount of champions who can kind of counter that fight. It's brutal. It's incredibly difficult. It's not ideal, but at least, like, that one wasn't, like, the absolute worst. But in my opinion, Act 6.2, it's the Mr. Sinister fight that is actually the worst for players overall. Champion boss, way too much skill, not enough progress and rewards for pushing that fight multiple times. But Mr. Sinister in particular, hard gate. No champ, no Heimdall, no progression. That's really what it came down to, and that's super frustrating. So yeah, that's the like major difference between a utility meta and a roster meta. And for the most part, I really want to applaud Kabam. They really do a very good job of pushing utility meta. You know, needing a armor up champion to deal with its havoc, or someone who repeatedly power drains, needing to have some kind of like maintained power control where like Void was the best answer for this Iron Man Infinity War. But honestly, you could do it with like Captain Marvel movie, you could do it with Captain America Infinity War or Human Torch. Like there are a lot of other potential options that could really do this fight. I think I've seen people do Havoc at the end where you just kind of bait the special 1 over and over and over again until you get to a special 3. You throw the special 3 to finish him off. Like it's brutal, it's tough, but it's definitely something I've seen. And it's just crazy, like you can react to those nodes in different ways, but you're not stuck with one specific answer. You know, and like Captain America Infinity War, this one, you know, not the best node interaction, but you can get through there with taunts. Not a lot of taunts in the game, but you could also get that through that with champions who can tank special 3s like Iron Man, like Killmonger or Gwenpool or Iceman is what I meant to say, Ghost with Hood synergy. Like there's so many options for tanking L3s that Captain America Infinity War is, you know, relatively reasonable, you know? The different kind of utility you need, the ability to tank L3s or taunt or power control is what you needed for that Captain America Infinity War. And then just like a really, really long fight, but still a large pool of options there. You know, and that was fine. I really applaud the creative way of introducing utility to the game and the need for diverse rosters. I just strongly disapprove of the roster meta, you know? So yeah, getting a little cyclic at this point, so I'll cut it off. But let me know what you think. Maybe you disagree. You think, hey, it's not pushing towards a roster meta. Kabam isn't pushing too many nodes or interactions out there that require like 1 to 3 answers only. Or maybe you agree and you want to like be part of the group of people who are saying, hey, Kabam, cut this shit out. Love the utility, hate the roster selectivity, and really, really cut back on those nodes, / honestly go back and fix them. Go back and edit them a little bit to make them more reasonable. That would be the ideal. But yeah, that's my stance on those at least. Otherwise, enjoy the game. It's still fun, still a great time, and plenty of other paths to push for your completion, as you can see. I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.